The sound echoed through the sacred halls of the Vatican like thunder. Cardinal Antonelli's head snapped sideways, his scarlet zucchetto falling to the marble floor as Swiss Guard Captain Lorenzo Mazzini's open palm connected with his face. The gathered clergy gasped in unison. For a moment, time stood suspended in the apostolic palace. "How dare you betray the Holy Father?" Lorenzo hissed, his voice barely containing the tremor of rage that coursed through his body. His ceremonial uniform, usually a symbol of stoic protection, now seemed to amplify his fury. Cardinal Antonelli touched his reddening cheek, eyes wide with shock and humiliation. Behind him, a door opened quietly, and Pope Francis himself stood witnessing the aftermath, his expression unreadable. Before we continue, if you enjoy true stories of shocking Vatican intrigue, make sure to click that subscribe button. This is the best way for you to support our work. Thank you very much, and let's continue. The incident that would come to shake the very foundations of the Vatican began 3 months earlier on a crisp January morning. Pope Francis had been working tirelessly on a new encyclical that would address corruption within the Church, a document that would name names and expose decades of financial misconduct that reached into the highest echelons of Vatican power. Cardinal Vittorio Antonelli had served in the Vatican Secretariat of Economic Affairs for 15 years. His aristocratic features and commanding presence had earned him both respect and fear among his peers. The son of a wealthy Milanese banking family, Antonelli had connections throughout European financial institutions and had helped steer Vatican investments for years. "Your Holiness, these reforms you propose, they will destabilize centuries of careful financial architecture," Antonelli argued during a private audience with Pope Francis. "Some discretion in these matters has always been necessary." Pope Francis sat at his simple desk, his weathered hands resting on a thick folder of documents. "Discretion is not the same as deception, Vittorio. The faithful deserve transparency. Christ drove the money changers from the temple for a reason." The Pope's simple quarters stood in stark contrast to the opulence that characterized much of Vatican City. Francis had rejected the papal apartments in favor of these modest rooms, a physical manifestation of his commitment to a more humble church. "The Church has survived by being pragmatic, Holy Father. These documents you're preparing to release will create chaos." Antonelli's voice remained respectful, but there was an edge to it now. Francis looked up at the Cardinal, his eyes gentle but unwavering. "Perhaps some chaos is needed to find our way back to the teachings of Jesus. I've made my decision." As Cardinal Antonelli left the papal chambers, his face betrayed nothing of the storm brewing within him. The encyclical, scheduled to be released in 3 months, would expose a complex network of offshore accounts, questionable investments, and systematic misappropriation of church funds. Among the architects of this system, Cardinal Vittorio Antonelli himself. Lorenzo Mazzini had served in the Swiss Guard for 12 years, rising to the rank of captain through dedication and an unwavering moral compass. At 34, he was younger than most to achieve his position, but his tactical brilliance and absolute loyalty to the papacy had accelerated his advancement. Every morning, Lorenzo would stand at attention outside the Pope's chambers, his colorful Renaissance-inspired uniform a striking contrast to his serious demeanor. Born to a humble family in a small village near Lucerne, Switzerland, Lorenzo had joined the Guard to serve God and the Church, not out of family tradition or ambition. "Captain Mazzini," Pope Francis greeted him one morning with his characteristic warmth. "Walk with me in the gardens. I find I need fresh air today." The Vatican gardens offered a peaceful sanctuary within the walls of the tiny city-state. Ancient trees provided shade as they walked along pathways that popes had traversed for centuries. "Your Holiness, is something troubling you?" Lorenzo asked, noticing the Pope's distracted manner. Francis sighed deeply. "I am about to release information that will cause great pain within the Church, but it's necessary pain, like lancing a wound to heal it. I fear there will be those who try to prevent this healing." Lorenzo stopped walking. "Are you in danger, Holy Father?" The Pope smiled wearily. "There are many kinds of danger, my son. I worry not for myself but for the truth. Some in our midst value power and wealth over the message of Christ. I am sworn to protect you, Your Holiness." With my life if necessary. Francis placed a hand on the young guard's shoulder. I know, Lorenzo, but sometimes the greatest threats come not from outside our walls, but from within them. Keep your eyes open in the coming weeks. As February turned to March, Cardinal Antonelli began holding secretive meetings with several other high-ranking church officials. Late at night, whispered conversations took place in the shadows of Vatican corridors and private chambers. Rumors swirled among the staff. Something was brewing within the sacred walls. Monsignor Paolo Rinaldi had served as the Pope's personal secretary for 5 years. His loyalty to Francis was unquestioned, his efficiency legendary. When he noticed Cardinal Antonelli exiting the papal archives late one evening, a place the cardinal had no reason to visit, Paolo's suspicions were aroused. "Your Eminence," Paolo called out, "is there something I can help you with? The archives are typically closed at this hour." Cardinal Antonelli smoothed his cassock, his smile not reaching his eyes. Monsignor Rinaldi, just some research for a theological matter." The archivist made an exception for me. "I see. What theological question brings you here so urgently?" Antonelli's expression hardened slightly. "Nothing that need concern the Pope's secretary." "Good evening, Monsignor." As the cardinal strode away, Paolo noticed something unusual. A small flash drive partially visible in Antonelli's hand. Something rarely used in the predominantly paper archives of ancient Vatican documents. Paolo immediately reported the incident to Captain Mazzini. "It may be nothing, Captain," but his manner was concerning. Lorenzo thanked the Monsignor and began his own quiet investigation. He stationed guards near the archives and requested logs of all who entered, though careful not to alert Antonelli to his suspicions. 3 days later, Lorenzo's vigilance was rewarded when a junior guard reported overhearing a heated conversation between Cardinal Antonelli and Cardinal Bianchi, another powerful figure in the Vatican financial structure. "The documents cannot see the light of day, Vittorio," Bianchi had whispered harshly. "We will all be ruined. Have you secured copies?" "Yes, but that's not enough. They must be discredited before release, and if that fails..." The rest of the conversation had been lost as the cardinals moved further down the corridor. But Lorenzo had heard enough to be deeply troubled. That night, Lorenzo made a difficult decision. Without authorization, he placed a small recording device in the antechamber of Cardinal Antonelli's office. A serious breach of protocol, but one he felt necessary given the potential threat to the Pope. The next morning, Lorenzo listened to the recording with growing horror. Cardinal Antonelli and 3 other cardinals were planning to leak selective, altered portions of the Pope's encyclical to friendly media outlets before the official release, creating confusion and undermining its credibility. But more disturbingly, they discussed reaching out to certain influential individuals who might pressure the Pope into early retirement for health reasons, should the document threat persist. His predecessor stepped down. A precedent exists. Antonelli's voice had said coldly on the recording, "Francis is elderly. No one would question it, especially with the right medical opinions in place." Lorenzo sat in his small quarters, the weight of what he discovered pressing down on him. This was more than church politics. This was a conspiracy against the Pope himself. He needed to inform Francis immediately, but he also needed concrete evidence beyond an unauthorized recording that would never be admissible. As March progressed, Pope Francis noticed increasing resistance to his daily work. Documents he requested would be delayed, meetings rescheduled, and a subtle atmosphere of obstruction seemed to permeate the Vatican offices. His isolation was being carefully orchestrated. "They're closing ranks against you, Holy Father," Paolo informed him one evening as they reviewed the day's correspondence. "Cardinal Antonelli has been meeting with the Papal Foundation directors and several influential donors." Francis nodded sadly. "The money speaks loudly, doesn't it? But God speaks louder still." 2 weeks before the encyclical was due to be released, Lorenzo's surveillance revealed that Cardinal Antonelli had arranged for a private meeting with a journalist from a major Italian newspaper known for sensationalist coverage of Vatican affairs. Using his authority as captain of the guard, Lorenzo arranged to have the journalist detained at the Vatican entrance for security verification, while he hurried to inform the Pope. "Your Holiness," I believe Cardinal Antonelli is planning to leak distorted information from your encyclical today. Lorenzo stood rigidly at attention in the Pope's study, his uniform immaculate, his expression grave. Francis looked up from his desk, his eyes tired but resolute. You have evidence of this, Captain Mazzini? Lorenzo hesitated, then produced a small device. This contains recordings of conversations between Cardinal Antonelli and others. I must confess I obtained them without proper authorization, Your Holiness. I am prepared to accept any discipline for this breach. The Pope gestured for Lorenzo to sit, an unusual request that indicated the seriousness of the moment. Let me hear them. As the recordings played, Francis's expression remained unchanged, though his eyes grew sadder with each damning word. When the audio finished, silence filled the room. You took an extraordinary risk, Captain, Francis finally said. I am sworn to protect you, Holy Father. And you believe the threat is imminent? Guess. A journalist is waiting at the gate right now, delayed by my orders. I believe Antonelli plans to provide him with altered documents today. Pope Francis rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking out over St. Peter's Square where faithful from around the world gathered. Bring Cardinal Antonelli to me, immediately, and ensure we are not disturbed. Lorenzo bowed slightly. Yes, Your Holiness. Finding Cardinal Antonelli proved challenging. He was not in his office or his residence. Finally, a staff member reported seeing him entering the Vatican secret archives, the restricted section that housed the Church's most sensitive documents. When Lorenzo arrived at the archives, he found Antonelli hurriedly photographing documents with a small digital camera. The Cardinal froze when he saw the Swiss guard captain in the doorway. This area is restricted, Your Eminence, Lorenzo said coldly. Even to a cardinal without specific authorization. Antonelli straightened, summoning his considerable dignity. I have every right to be here, Captain. Your jurisdiction is protection, not questioning the movements of princes of the Church. The Holy Father has requested your immediate presence. A flicker of unease crossed Antonelli's aristocratic features. I will attend to him after I complete my work here. Lorenzo stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. That was not a request, Your Eminence. You will come now. For a tense moment it seemed Antonelli might refuse. Then, with deliberate slowness, he placed the camera in his pocket. Very well. Lead the way, Captain. As they walked through the Vatican corridors, Lorenzo noticed Antonelli typing something on his phone. With a swift movement, he reached out and took the device from the Cardinal's hands. This will be returned to you after your audience with His Holiness. Antonelli's face flushed with anger. You overstep your authority. How dare you? I act on papal authority, Your Eminence. Please continue walking. When they arrived at the Pope's study, Francis was standing by the window, his back to the door. He turned slowly as they entered, his face solemn. Leave us, Captain, Francis said quietly, but remain just outside. Lorenzo bowed and exited, closing the door behind him. He stood at attention, straining to hear the conversation inside. The voices were muffled, but it was clear the exchange was becoming heated. You would destroy centuries of church autonomy with this reckless transparency. Antonelli's voice rose enough to be heard clearly. What I would destroy is corruption, not autonomy, Francis replied, his voice remaining calm. You naive old man. The Church requires financial freedom to operate in this world. Your predecessors understood this. Lorenzo tensed at the disrespect in the Cardinal's tone. Then came words that made his blood run cold. Release this document as written, and you will find yourself removed, one way or another. There are forces at work here beyond your control, Francis. Without thinking, Lorenzo pushed the door open. Pope Francis stood calmly behind his desk, while Cardinal Antonelli loomed over him, his face contorted with fury and contempt. Step back from the Holy Father immediately, Lorenzo commanded. Antonelli turned, sneering. This is a private discussion, Captain. Close the door and... He stays, Pope Francis interrupted. I believe we're finished here, Cardinal. You have made your position quite clear, as have I. The encyclical will be released as written, with all evidence intact. Antonelli's face darkened. Then you leave us no choice but to act. For the good of the Church. Is that a threat against the Holy Father? Lorenzo stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to the ceremonial sword at his side. A weapon that, unlike in centuries past, was now merely symbolic. The Cardinal laughed coldly. Control your guard dog, Francis. And remember, many popes have had short reigns when they failed to understand the realities of their office. It was this final remark, delivered with such naked malice toward the gentleman who had devoted his life to service, that broke something in Lorenzo's careful composure. Before he could even register his own movement, his hand struck out, connecting with Antonelli's face in a resounding slap that echoed through the papal chambers. The Cardinal staggered backward, shock replacing his arrogance. His renzachetto fell to the floor, rolling in a small circle before coming to rest. "How dare you betray the Holy Father?" Lorenzo whispered, trembling with the enormity of what he had done. Striking a prince of the Church, in the Pope's presence no less. The door opened wider, and several clergy who had been waiting outside for their own appointments stood witnessing the tableau. The Swiss guard captain standing rigidly, the Cardinal touching his reddened cheek, and Pope Francis watching it all with an unreadable expression. In the stunned silence that followed, everyone expected the Pope's immediate condemnation of this unprecedented breach of protocol. What happened instead would change the course of Vatican history. Pope Francis walked slowly around his desk and bent down with some difficulty to pick up the fallen zucchetto. Rather than returning it to Antonelli, he placed it on his own desk and turned to face not just those in the room, but seemingly addressing the Church itself. "In the Gospel of Matthew," he began, his voice quiet but carrying clearly, "Jesus says, 'Whatever you have said in the dark will be heard in the light, and what you have whispered behind closed doors will be shouted from the housetops.'" He turned to Cardinal Antonelli. "You have served the Church for many years, Vittorio, but somewhere along the way you began to serve power and wealth instead. I have evidence of your offshore accounts, your manipulation of Church investments for personal gain, and now your conspiracy to undermine papal authority." Antonelli's face drained of color. "You cannot prove." Francis held up a hand. "I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, that you would remember your vows, your calling." Captain Mezzina's action, while impulsive, stems from a pure heart, true devotion to what the Church should stand for. The Pope turned to Lorenzo. "Violence is never the answer, my son, even in defense of truth. But your loyalty is noted, and God sees the intention of your heart." To the astonished onlookers, Francis continued, "What happens next may shock many of you, but it is necessary. Cardinal Antonelli will be removed from his positions effective immediately, pending a full investigation. The encyclical will be released tomorrow, not in 2 weeks. The truth cannot wait any longer." Antonelli's shock gave way to calculation. "You don't have the support, Francis. The College of Cardinals may well be divided," the Pope acknowledged, "but I answer to a higher authority than the College." What followed in the next 24 hours stunned the Vatican and the world. Pope Francis, in an unprecedented move, called an emergency press conference where he personally presented evidence of financial misconduct involving several high-ranking Church officials. The documents detailed a complex web of corruption that had drained millions from Church charities into private accounts. Cardinal Antonelli and 3 others were suspended from their duties pending investigation by both Vatican authorities and international financial regulators. The Swiss Guard, under Lorenzo's command, were tasked with securing relevant records and ensuring no evidence disappeared. The Catholic faithful around the world reacted with a mixture of shock, pain, and ultimately, support for the Pope's courageous stand. Donations to legitimate Church charities actually increased in the following weeks, as the faithful appreciated the new transparency. Within the Vatican walls, the immediate aftermath was tense. Lorenzo expected to be disciplined, possibly even dismissed from the Swiss Guard for striking a cardinal. Instead, he found himself summoned to a private audience with Pope Francis 3 days after the revelations. "Kneel, my son," Francis instructed when they were alone. Lorenzo knelt, head bowed, prepared to accept whatever consequence was coming. Instead, he felt the Pope's hands on his shoulders. Your methods were imperfect, but your heart was true. In the history of the Church, sometimes God has used imperfect instruments to bring about necessary change. I struck a cardinal, Your Holiness. I dishonored my position. Francis smiled gently. You defended the Church against those who would corrupt it from within. But yes, there must be consequence for the method. Lorenzo nodded, accepting whatever judgment would come. Your penance is this. You will personally oversee the implementation of new financial transparency measures within the Swiss Guard and security operations. And you will visit Cardinal Antonelli in his retreat and ask his forgiveness for the manner of your confrontation, though not for your loyalty to truth. Lorenzo looked up, surprised. You wish me to apologize to him? I wish you to demonstrate the mercy we preach, Francis corrected. Cardinal Antonelli has lost much. His position, his reputation, possibly his freedom if civil charges are brought. But he has not lost the opportunity for redemption. None of us has while we draw breath. The weeks that followed brought dramatic changes to Vatican operations. New oversight committees were established with lay experts in finance and ethics given real authority. Banking practices were reformed, investments scrutinized for both financial and moral responsibility. Cardinal Antonelli, facing potential criminal charges in multiple countries, requested and was granted a private audience with Pope Francis. No one knows exactly what was said between them, but afterward, Antonelli voluntarily surrendered his financial records and began cooperating with investigators. Most surprisingly to many, 3 months after the confrontation that had begun with a slap, Cardinal Antonelli retreated to a remote monastery, renouncing his cardinal's title and privileges, choosing instead to live in humble service. His written statement, released through the Vatican press office, acknowledged his failings and asked forgiveness from the Church and its people. As for Captain Lorenzo Mazzina, he did indeed visit Antonelli before the former cardinal's retreat. Their meeting was brief but profound. I have come to ask your forgiveness for striking you, Lorenzo said formally, standing stiffly in the simple room where Antonelli was preparing to depart. The once proud cardinal looked years older, his face lined with the weight of his exposed sins. No, Captain, it is I who should ask forgiveness. Your hand delivered a much gentler correction than I deserved. He paused, looking out the window toward St. Peter's dome shining in the distance. Sometimes God uses unexpected means to wake us from our spiritual sleep. For me, it was the shock of that moment, seeing myself through the eyes of a man of genuine faith. When Lorenzo reported this conversation to Pope Francis, the Pope nodded softly. Grace works in unexpected ways, doesn't it? From a moment of violence has come peace. From exposure has come healing. 1 year after the events that had shaken the Vatican to its foundations, a special Mass was celebrated in St. Peter's Basilica. Financial reforms had taken root, transparency had increased, and though the process had been painful, a renewal was visibly underway. Pope Francis, against protocol, invited both Captain Mazzini and the now brother Vittorio Antonelli to stand near him at one point in the ceremony. The Church is always in need of reform, Francis addressed the congregation, because it is made up of fallible humans. Sometimes that reform comes through careful study and prayerful reflection, and sometimes, he glanced at Lorenzo, it comes through a moment of righteous passion that breaks through walls of deception. He turned to Brother Antonelli, whose humble brown robes replaced the scarlet he once wore. And sometimes, grace comes through falling and rising again, through facing our worst failures and finding God waiting there to help us begin anew. The Pope raised his hands, encompassing the entire congregation. This is the miracle of our faith, not that we are perfect, but that God works through our imperfections to create something beautiful. As the magnificent sounds of the choir filled the vast space of St. Peter's, Lorenzo stood tall in his Swiss Guard uniform, profoundly aware that his moment of lost control had been transformed into a catalyst for renewal. Brother Antonelli, head bowed in genuine humility, represented the possibility of redemption that stood at the very heart of Christian teaching. And Pope Francis, the humble man who had come to the papacy with a vision of a church that served the poor rather than power, watched as the seeds of authentic reform took root. The path had not been what any of them had expected, but then God's ways rarely were. Outside in St. Peter's Square, thousands of the faithful gathered, their faces upturned toward the basilica. The church had been wounded, but in that wounding, healing had begun. The slap that had echoed through the Vatican had become not just a moment of human drama, but a call to awakening that would resonate for generations to come. In the quiet of his heart, Lorenzo reflected on the strange journey. He had sworn to protect the Pope with his life, never imagining that his most important service would come not through physical protection but through a single impulsive action that had cracked open decades of corruption. The Spirit moves as it will, Pope Francis had told him once. Our job is not to understand God's methods, but to be available when He chooses to use us. As the Mass concluded and the Pope offered a final blessing, Lorenzo caught Francis looking at him with that characteristic gentle smile. In that moment, he understood that sometimes the most profound defense of faith comes not through strength or strategy, but through simple, uncompromising truth, even when that truth arrives in unexpected ways. The slap heard around the Vatican had become a touch of grace, reminding the Church and the world that renewal often begins with a single moment of clarity, a brave action, and the courage to face the consequences of standing for what is right, no matter the cost. In Rome, as evening fell and the lights illuminated St. Peter's dome against the darkening sky, the ancient and eternal city bore witness once again to the endless cycle of human failing and divine redemption that had characterized the Church from its very beginning. The story of the Swiss Guard, the Cardinal, and the Pope would be told for years to come not as a scandal, but as a testament to the possibility of genuine reform and the unexpected ways that God works through human instruments to bring about His purposes. And in that story would be a lesson for all who heard it, that sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is the courage to challenge corruption, even when it wears the robes of sacred authority. That true faith is not blind obedience but fierce devotion to the principles that underlie all genuine spirituality, and that even in our moments of failure, grace awaits not as a reward for perfection, but as a gift that transforms our weaknesses into stepping stones toward a deeper truth. As Brother Antonelli and Captain Mazzini left the basilica that day, they nodded to each other in mutual respect, two men forever connected by a moment of confrontation that had led them both to profound transformation. The slap that had once divided them had ultimately united them in service to something greater than themselves, and Pope Francis, watching them go, offered a quiet prayer of gratitude for the mysterious ways of providence that had turned a moment of crisis into an opportunity for the Church to remember its true purpose in the world. The Swiss Guard who slapped a cardinal had indeed stunned the Vatican, not just with the act itself, but with the wave of purification that followed, washing away layers of corruption and leaving behind the stronger foundation of authentic faith that had always been the true strength of the Church in its finest moments. As night fell over the Vatican, the Eternal City slept more peacefully than it had in years, cradled in the promise that even in our darkest moments, light finds a way to break through, sometimes in the most unexpected ways.